Modern society has made astonishing progress in many areas of life. Whether that's made us happier or better off psychologically is less clear, particularly in light of rising rates of depression and anxiety disorders. Last year, the United Kingdom even appointed a minister of loneliness. What is going on here, and does it have anything to do with humans getting too far ahead of ourselves from an evolutionary standpoint? Joining us now to consider that, in Austin, Texas, David Buss, evolutionary psychologist at the University of Texas at Austin and author of The Evolution of Desire, Strategies of Human Mating. And in Ithaca, New York, David Sloan Wilson, State University of New York Distinguished Professor of Biology and Anthropology at Binghamton University and author of the forthcoming book, This View of Life, Completing the Darwinian Revolution. And given that we have both of our guests named David here, I think we'll do this a little more formally, and it will be Professor Wilson and Professor Buss. Both of you, welcome to TVO, and let's just start our conversation by laying down some of these facts to help set the table for the discussion to come. According to the World Health Organization, depression is now the leading cause of ill health and disability worldwide. Rates of depression have risen by more than 18% since 2005. In Canada, suicide is one of the leading causes of death in both men and women from adolescence to middle age. Last year in the United States, the suicide death rate was the highest it's been in at least 50 years. Here in the province of Ontario, more than a third of high school students indicate a moderate to serious level of psychological distress. That'd be symptoms of anxiety and depression. And as we suggested earlier this year, the British government created what it calls a Minister of Loneliness to help combat what the Prime Minister there, Theresa May, called this, quote, sad reality of modern life. Professor Wilson, to you first. How can looking to our evolutionary past help us understand the levels of depression and anxiety in the modern world today?
Well, the first thing to say is that for most of our existence, we've lived in small, highly cooperative groups. And so that is the natural human social environment. And that's what is in such short supply today. Professor
Buss, what would you add in terms of to what extent evolutionary theory can help us understand what's happening here?
Yes, well, I think there's a fundamental mismatch between ancestral environments and modern environments. Like Professor Wilson said, we evolved in the context of small group living where there was no such thing as spending a lot of time alone like we do now in the modern environment. In the United States, something like 37% of people live alone in isolated conditions. We evolved in small group living, also with close kin around who were invested in our welfare. Now we live with our kin scattered to the winds, and so we don't have that sheer number of people and quality of people who are invested in our welfare.
Do you find that odd, Professor Wilson, that we seem to live in cities that encompass millions and millions of people, and yet we're lonelier than ever?
Well, one point to make is that in modern times, things can still be good. The trends that we're talking about are trends that only took place within the last 20 or 30 years. So things are falling apart now, but things can be made better, even in modern life.
Do you agree with that, Professor Buss?
Yes, of course they can be made better by identifying precisely what the mismatches are between ancestral and modern environments.
Susan Pinker is a person who's been on this program a few times, and she has written about this topic, and we wanted to just play a snippet of what she said last time she was on, and then we'll come back and chat. Mr. Director, if you would, please.
The areas of your brain that become activated when you're experiencing physical pain are very similar to the areas that are activated when you're socially isolated. We are a social species, and being alone raises alarm signals physiologically that more or less tell you, if you don't fix this problem, you are a goner.
Professor Wilson, from an evolutionary standpoint, why would loneliness be so painful?
Well, Susan Pinker is exactly right. Our brains evolved with cooperation in mind. We seamlessly integrate our social resources and our personal resources. And do you know that pain itself is a social signal? So when we feel pain, in a sense, we're crying out for others to help us. So we feel pain in a different way than animals do because we are that social a species.
Professor Buss, I guess our ancient ancestors struggled for survival against the elements in a way that we don't have to today, thankfully, but has that also had the perverse effect of creating the conditions that don't allow the kind of closeness that they had back in the day?
Yes, I think that's true. And one of the key variables is that in ancestral times, we went through Darwin called the hostile forces of nature, where we had to combat literal survival and death issues. And so we found out through these trials and tribulations who our true friends were and who our fair weather friends were. In the modern environment, stripped from these hostile forces of nature, we don't go through these critical tests where we know who we can really rely on in times of crisis. And so even though we have a lot of superficial friends, people have Twitter friends and Facebook friends by the thousands, we don't have a sense of deep friendship that most people would have had ancestrally by going through those trials and tribulations.
Well, Professor Buss, since you raised the president's favorite thing in the world, social media, let's pick up on that part of the conversation and move on. One study said, I think this was in 2015, said that people feel depressed after spending a great deal of time on Facebook because they feel bad when comparing themselves to others and the lives that they think other people are leading. Let's go back to our evolutionary past. Haven't we always compared ourselves, Professor Wilson, to the others in our group?
Yes, but we've also been in small groups of fiercely egalitarian. So basically, the sentiment is that we're all moral equals. You are not better than me, especially morally. And so I think the kind of ranking that is so common nowadays is in fact toxic and different than the normal human existence in a small group setting, which is highly, highly egalitarian.
And Professor Buss, needless to say, our ancestors did not have Tinder, which meant that the potential,
Right.
our potential mates thousands of years ago were fairly limited compared to today. How has that contributed, in your view, to our sad modern condition?
Yes, absolutely. So ancestrally, in our entire lifetimes, we would have encountered perhaps a few dozen potential mates. Now, with internet dating services, Tinder and OkCupid, many others, we literally have thousands or millions of potential mates. Now, that has a good side to it in that we can, in principle, have contact with people that we never would come into contact with in our day-to-day lives. But at the same time, it creates this illusion that there's always someone a bit better out there. And so I think the rapid declines in relationships, in marriages, in enduring romantic commitments are in part a function of this weird modern novel environment of internet dating.
So too much choice can be a bad thing.
Absolutely, and they've shown this with other things. If you give people 6 choices of jam, people taste a couple and then they select one and buy it. If you give people 24 choices of jam, they get overwhelmed and don't buy anything. So that jam experiment also, I think, applies to the mating environment.
Professor Wilson, do you see a mismatch between how children developed and were educated in our evolutionary past and how they are today?
That's right. That's a big mismatch. If you look at how education took place back then, it did not resemble at all formal education today. It took place largely in the context of play, basically. And this is another thing that's in tremendously short supply. Kids are growing up both inside and outside of school with highly scripted activities. They're not allowed just to go outside and play the way our parents and grandparents did. So that's a big one, is the lack of unstructured and self-motivated play.
And Professor Wilson, follow up, if you would, on this notion. The connection today between it seems to be we have this need to be so clean and hygienic, and depression and anxiety. Do those dots connect for you?
Yeah, I mean, mismatches are everywhere. I mean, we've created these modern environments, which have excellent aspects, of course. We don't want to go back to the Stone Age. But then there's subtle differences that we never anticipated. One of those is that the environment can be too clean, too hygienic, and our immune systems did not evolve against that background. And so when our immune systems go haywire, then that results in all kinds of physical and mental disorders, including anxiety and depression, for the simple reason that our immune systems are evolved to develop in the presence of all sorts of microbes and other species. When those are absent, then all bets are off as far as our immune systems are concerned.
David Buss, you looked like you wanted to respond to that.
Yeah. I just wanted to add one thing that with respect to these mismatches that we've been talking about, and that is that depression and anxiety rates are about twice as high among women compared to men. And I think this is also in part a result of a mismatch. We don't know what the depression rates are in more traditional cultures, hunter-gatherer cultures, but I think we do know that the social isolation, the lack of a small group of people and kin who are invested in your welfare has a more profound effect on women than on men. And so I think that sex difference in depression and anxiety is something that we also need to attend to.
David Wilson, do we have any idea why that is?
Oh, there's so many possibilities, but I think Professor Buss put his finger on one of them, is that base social connectedness, basically, might be something that impacts women more than men. But the reverse is also true. We find, for example, in college environments, women are doing better than men. I think traditional male sex roles are becoming obsolete, and men don't really know what to do, how to act in modern societies where such things as physical labor, physical strength, social dominance, all of these things are being called into question. So I think that men are as at risk as women.
Professor Buss, you want to come back on that?
Yeah, well, I think they're at risk in different ways, but it is a fact that depression rates are twice in women what they are in men. And Professor Wilson is absolutely correct. I mean, women are thriving. For example, they get better grades in college, they have lower dropout rates, et cetera. But nonetheless, their anxiety and depression are still high. And so there's something missing in the modern environment that was undoubtedly prevalent or present in the ancestral environments that we need to attend to. So I think Professor Wilson is right. Men and women have faced different adaptive challenges in this from different forms of mismatch.
Professor Buss, do you want to follow up and speculate on what that missing thing might be?
Well, I'd like to emphasize that mismatch is something which exists for all evolutionary processes. We tend to think of it as a mismatch with genetic evolution, but cultural evolution generates mismatches, and personal evolution generates mismatches. In fact, anxiety and depression itself is an indicator of personal mismatch, that the person is basically not well adapted to their environment for any number of reasons, and therefore needs to change. And anxiety and depression are some of the mechanisms that get us to change, or at least make us feel that we need to change. So we need to pay attention to all forms of evolution, the fast forms, culture and personal evolution, in addition to the slow forms, genetic evolution.
Go ahead, Professor Buss.
Yeah, I would just add to that. So on this issue of mismatches, a couple that we haven't mentioned are that our ancestors were outside most of the time. They were exposed to sunlight and they were physically active. They were hunting, they were gathering, they were building shelters, they were migrating from place to place. And so in the modern environment, we live inside. We don't have the sunlight exposure. We have lower levels of activity or energy expenditure. And we know that exposure to sunlight and low activity levels are linked to depression. And so I think these physical differences in how we go about our day-to-day lives are critical mismatches that also influence, in addition to the social mismatches, the physical ones also influence our depression and anxiety levels.
Fascinating. Okay, let me read something here from Robert Wright, writing in Time magazine. This is a couple of decades ago. He wrote, "A larger threat to mental health may be the way civilization thwarts civility. There is a kinder, gentler side of human nature, and it seems increasingly to be a victim of repression. The good news is that doing this job entailed some quite pleasant feelings. Because social cooperation improves the chances of survival, natural selection imbued our minds with an infrastructure for friendship, including affection, gratitude, and trust." To you first, David Buss, is that infrastructure, those sort of better angels of our nature, being repressed in 2018 to the detriment of our mental health?
Yes, I don't like the word repression because it has these kind of hydraulic Freudian connotations, but what I would say, the better angels of our nature aren't as activated. We do have these adaptations, these psychological adaptations for generosity and trust and sharing and communal living, and I don't think they are as activated in the modern environment, in part because we don't go through these critical tests and we don't know who our true friends are. I think that's a key thing, distinguishing true friends from fair weather friends.
Professor Wilson?
Well, I think we need to appreciate that variation in such things as trust. There's lots of variation, even in large-scale societies. If you look at other nations, for example, the Scandinavian nations, I spent a lot of time studying Norway, and there's very, very high levels of trust in their society, in their government. And those are sizable nations. So it's not the case that modern times inevitably do these things. There's lots of elbow room for improvement in modern times. We need to be comparative, and then we need to learn how to build these things in at a large scale. That said, it certainly is the case that worldwide, especially in our own country, Canada less than America, but still. We have low levels of trust, and that cannot be good.
Well, let me follow up with you, Professor Wilson, because you did study specifically how we evolved in cooperative groups as opposed to as individuals. For good or for bad, do you see people, maybe for good and for bad, do you see people retreating back to tribal groups in 2018?
Yes, there is. There's become a skepticism for large-scale cooperation, globalism, and the like. It has not worked. Especially the neoliberal economic model has not worked. The response for that is a distress, generalized distress, and sometimes where that leads is to basically allegiance to smaller-scale nationalism, tribalism, and so on. And yes, that is what's happening, and it cannot be good. We need to basically learn how to cooperate at a larger scale. We need actually globalism done right, but that is very different than the neoliberal economic model.
Well, David Buss, we seem to be dancing around a little bit. The word that comes to mind is Trump here, isn't it?
Well, I think that, to pick up on that issue, in order to activate some of these better angels of our nature, I think we have to decrease the level of polarization or tribalism or intergroup conflict that seems to have developed in the modern environment. We have adaptations for intergroup conflict because historically over evolutionary time, we were engaged some of the time in small group warfare. And so I think some of these nastier coalitional adaptations, hatred toward outgroups, are being hyperactivated. And so I think attention needs to be paid to deactivating some of those in addition to activating some of the better angels of our nature.
Would you say, though, Professor Buss, that the current President of the United States is a sort of a political manifestation of all of what we've been talking about right now?
Yes, I think he's certainly one manifestation. I mean, there's pretty good evidence of heightened polarization at a lot of levels, certainly within the United States, but I think also in Western Europe as well.
Okay, I guess I'm going to ask you to humor me for a second here, because someone who would probably agree with everything that both of you have said so far on our program tonight is the Unabomber. Ted Kaczynski in 1995 wrote the following. He said, "I attribute the social and psychological problems of modern society to the fact that society requires people to live under conditions radically different from those under which the human race evolved." Now, the Unabomber's solution to this problem, of course, was to destroy everything that had anything to do with technology and try and live in a more primitive state, which he did in the middle of nowhere. Let's talk about that. Professor Wilson, we don't want to do that, do we?
Of course not. Please don't associate me with the Unabomber. No, we need to expand the scale of cooperation. We cannot do that by just living entirely in small-scale society. Trump is not the problem. Trump is a symptom of the problem. And the problem, in large part, is something we haven't mentioned yet, is extreme inequality. And this is very interesting because if extreme inequality exists at the level of small groups, That's toxic also. The reason that small groups function well is because they establish relative equality. If you establish relative equality at the large scale, then things function well. They have in the past, they can in the future. In many ways, the root problem here is extreme inequality. If we could address that at any scale, then that's a big part of the solution.
Go ahead, Professor Buss.
Yeah, I think that is, Professor Wilson is correct that is a key problem. And I think one of the features of that is the invention of cash economies, which are only about 7,000 years old. So ancestrally, you couldn't stockpile resources and produce the kind of dramatic inequality that we see today. Cash economies allow people to stockpile resources in a way that's evolutionarily unprecedented. And so I don't know if we'll ever go back to pre-cash economies, but I think that is one of the modern cultural inventions that has exacerbated the inequality among people today.
Let's get Robert Wright back into this discussion here, and I want to read an excerpt from his recent book, which is called Why Buddhism is True. Here we go. You get a pretty plausible explanation of the human predicament as diagnosed by the Buddha. Yes, as he said, pleasure is fleeting, and yes, this leaves us recurrently dissatisfied. And the reason is pleasure is designed by natural selection to evaporate, so that the ensuing dissatisfaction will get us to pursue more pleasure. Natural selection doesn't want us to be happy. After all, it just wants us to be productive, in its narrow sense of productive. And the way to make us productive is to make the anticipation of pleasure very strong, but the pleasure itself not very long-lasting. This notion, Professor Wilson, that evolution doesn't want us to be happy is intriguing. Where are you on that?
It's part of the story. It's half correct. Yes, there's those fleeting forms of pleasure, and then also what counts as pain is also adaptive. But there's also more profound forms of pleasure, which practices and beliefs such as Buddhism provides. If you look at the Dalai Lama, for example, he looks pretty happy most of the time. And so I think that there's forms of pleasure which are more sustaining, they're more holistic, they're more empathetic, they're more pro-social, and also are more lasting.
How would you react to that quote, Professor Buss?
I think Robert Wright is right on, so to speak, with respect to that quote. That is, if evolution designed an adaptation to just produce constant happiness, we wouldn't do anything. It's the variability, the pellets that we get, the psychological pellets when we achieve fitness-relevant goals that keep us motivated toward those ends, and also avoiding the painful aspects. So living in a constant state of happiness and bliss is not in the cards.
Now, Professor Wilson,
let me push back against my esteemed colleague here. Again, I agree half, but there's a lot of research showing that just imagine being in two psychological states, one of fear and threat, as opposed to one of safety and satiety. There's lots and lots of research that shows, of course, we have different psychological responses to those. And a fearful situation, a threatening situation, is not a state of mind conducive to any kind of open-ended learning. If we're safe and secure, then we broaden and build, we feel happy, we laugh, we socialize. And so I think that this is something that's an important part of the big evolutionary picture.
David Buss, we actually encourage civilized disagreement on this program, so if you want to take him back on, be my guest.
Yeah. Well, I don't fundamentally disagree with what he's saying, but I guess I'll just mention one other aspect of this. So one of the things that we are motivated toward is romantic relationships and sexual relationships. And one of the interesting sex differences in the modern environment that I think is pretty prevalent is that men can gain sexual relationships often without investing in romantic relationships. And I think that's one of the problems these days. That's partly what's resulting in the anomie among men, the lack of ambition among men, and why women are exceeding men on so many metrics on college campuses. And so, this relates in part to the issue of happiness. So So you have sexual resources that are being kind of constantly provided, then that lowers one's motivation to actually do things to initiate relationships.
Now, Professor Wilson, you did suggest earlier in our conversation that in spite of all of this doom and gloom that we've been discussing, you do see a way forward. Do you want to help us with the way out of this?
Oh, I see a lot of the way forward. Knowing what the ancestral environment was like can help us create equivalence in modern environments. For sure, we want to operate in small groups as much as possible. We want those groups to be egalitarian. We want them to be structured for fairness. We want them to be challenging, which they can be without being threatening. Businesses often put this to good use by creating teams that do challenging things. I think that there's so much room for improvement. And in some ways, actually, the limiting factor is that not enough people actually think of this and view this through an evolutionary lens. So I'm grateful that you have David Buss and myself on this program, because I think the more you see this through an evolutionary lens, then the more solutions come into view.
David Buss, small, egalitarian, structured, challenging. What would you add to that list of how we get out of this?
I would agree with all those and add, and sorry to repeat myself, but we need to increase our activity level. We need to increase exposure to sunlight. We need to increase our investment in friends. And what I suggest, I study mostly mating, human mating and romantic relationships. What I suggest to people who are considering a long-term relationship is to go on vacation together in a foreign country so that you experience trials and tribulations and you see how your potential partner responds to these stresses and strains, and that provides critical information about whether this is going to be a sustainable long-term romantic relationship. And I think there might be analogs with respect to friendship as well. So I think that the lack of those critical tests is very important in closing some of these gaps between ancestral and modern environments.
Gentlemen, that's our time. I can't thank you enough for appearing on TVO tonight for a most fascinating discussion. David Buss in Austin, Texas. David Sloan Wilson in Ithaca, New York. Thanks so much to both of you.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you.
The Agenda with Steve Bacon is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario, helping businesses stay on the right side of change with strategic thinking, insightful decisions, and business leadership. Are you on the right side of change? Ask an Ontario CPA.